how does that notion of the vision respond to social movements as they are organically evolving, as you so nicely described earlier on. And I guess let's sort of now dig into the notion that we have a space and choices have been made about what to fund, and there's a need to evaluate all of what comes in. And as you've talked quite extensively about, I believe this semester, there has been a vast expansion in the use of performance metrics across this sector. And I think that the topic for tonight, sort of on the detailed level, is about what are the costs of that change in this sector. And so one could step back, as I think one of your readings asked the question as well, if the NAACP went to the Rockefeller Foundation, or maybe not your foundation wouldn't have had this answer quite the same today, and said, hi, we want to organize some big rallies. We are moving the civil rights movement ahead, and we've got this guy, Dr. King, and he's going to give some talks, and we've got these people who are sitting on buses. Now, whoever it was, not that there was a single organizing moment of that, but a many number of groups. What would the questions have been asked back to them, and what would the costs of that been in terms of moving some of that work forward?
One of the limitations of formal philanthropy is that it's oftentimes very focused on supporting established institutions rather than supporting individuals. And so in the example that you're crafting, you could see that the flexibility to support individuals or small, new, nascent groups of individuals would make it much more possible to support the growth of new views and new voices, right? And so I was talking with some colleagues today, contrasting what I'll call the old guard East Coast, Atlantic Seaboard foundations with the newfangled West Coast foundations that have grown out of the technology fortunes of the last 10 or 15 years, right? And think about it, right? So the East Coast foundations largely came out of the Industrial Revolution. The West Coast foundations are coming out of the Tech Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was much more of a top-down, command and control, institution-oriented, you need a big plant to function perspective. The West Coast, it's two guys in a garage, everyone has amazing potential, you never know when you're going to discover the next big idea, a very diverse cast of characters, all sorts of stuff, a much more diverse workforce, and so on. So to me, that's part of the explanation of why you see Skoll and Omidyar, these folks are supporting social entrepreneurs and talking about social entrepreneurship, Draper Richardson, things like that, because this is the world that they know. They believe in the capacity and the potential of the individual in a very different way than John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, the Mellons, and so on. So,
can you say something about the difference in what they're supporting, given that different orientation about how change occurs?
So I guess I would say that if you're supporting the individual, you're saying, you're a really bright, interesting guy, you see the world in an interesting way. I don't know quite what you're going to do, but here, have some money, have a year's worth of time to reflect, have a travel allowance. You can go, meet new people or to go into another culture and see how this stimulates you, right? So up front, you're not quite sure exactly what the result's going to be, right? But it's the incubation that happens in Silicon Valley. It's like, you're really bright, you have some interesting ideas, half of them probably won't work, but I think you've got potential and I think you're probably onto something, so I'm going to give you the resources to go with that, right?
And going to the notion of performance, what are you held accountable for then? What do you have to show in that paradigm?
I would hazard a guess that it's a it when you see it performance, right? That up front, that the criteria, it's going to be much more from the gut, right? And this is why you hear the phrase venture philanthropy, the notion that there are approaches and attitudes and ways of working that philanthropists can learn from venture capitalists. Now, venture philanthropy often implies I'm going to give you money and I'm going to sit on your board and I'm going to watch you closely and I'm going to have frequent conversations with you and I'm going to because I'm having frequent conversations with you, know what your needs are, and then if you have a capacity development need, I'll hook you up with someone who can help you, or this kind of stuff. So venture philanthropy in a lot of ways implies I'm going to be sort of, too close for comfort sometimes. But I would say that the part of venture capital work that celebrates the individual potential and is comfortable with supporting something where the conclusion is not known and the definition of success is not clear. You have a general idea, right? I know that you might be more likely to work on workforce issues than arts issues just because of your background, and I'm comfortable with that, so I'm going to give you the support. And
I think you hit it dead on, that there is this creative capital spirit, right? That people hold you and just say, and there's something, intuitive about, my faith in her or him, that there's a spark or there's a light about the individual. And then when you look at, can she really make this happen? I think there's a kind of a perspective of kind of like looking at, her social networks, her pedigree. Right. There's a larger kind of like, I guess almost like a stock analysis, a portfolio analysis of, does she have the kind of entrepreneurial pieces or mechanics or tools to make the said quote-unquote outcome, right? And I think what's also very interesting about, and I never thought about this, is kind of like, East Coast framework versus like a West Coast, the folks who kind of came out of the .com industry. But I think is also very honest about that is the fact that they're very generationally imprinted, right? So this kind of spirit of free-flowing, creative capital or being a part of like venture capital parties, I mean, that comes from a particular moment in American history, right? Where people had access to a market. Like, I don't know if that's actually going to continue, going forward. And I've come to terms with the fact that oftentimes people's political, social justice values or movements are really rooted out of the framework that they were born in. Because it's interesting, because when I can always kind of tell when I meet someone, like, okay, they must have been born in this particular era because they're speaking in this type of language versus someone who has come out of a much more technicalized framework.
So when you were describing the sort of credentials that you would look for in supporting a social entrepreneur, you named social networks. And again, I think this is an amazing contrast between sort of old guard East Coast and new guard West Coast. So you were thinking of social networks, I believe, as an example of someone's future capacity to get something done and the ability to be inclusive and tap a wide range of perspectives and resources for success, right? And I would say on the old guard East Coast perspective, foundations would look to see what your quote unquote social networks were, but it was more what your pedigree was. Were you known to the right people? Did you sort of meet a certain bar? Were you inside the club already? And if you were inside the club, well, then you can have our grant, which is in a lot of ways the exact opposite of the way you were identifying social networks. And I see that as just another illustration of the difference between the generations and how the money was made, and sort of philanthropy being exclusionary or philanthropy celebrating and supporting potential.